Welcome everyone to a dive into some stories of people who've claimed they had a time slip, or in other words, an event that seemed like they must have traveled through time. Just before we begin, consider subscribing if you like this kind of stuff. It helps the channel out. Anyways, with that in mind, let's get straight into the video now with the first entry. The Dawdleston Messages. The story of the Dawdleston Messages begins in 1985 when Ken Webster, along with his girlfriend Debbie and their friend Nick, moved into Meadow Cottage, an 18th century brick house in the small village of Dawdleston, England. The cottage, with its old world charm and history, seemed an ideal place for Ken, who was teaching at a local school, to settle down and perhaps to find some inspiration for his interests in contemporary music and old Jaguar cars. It wasn't long before strange occurrences, though, began to disrupt the tranquility of Meadow Cottage. Six-toed footprints appeared in the dust and seemed to climb up the walls between the bathroom and kitchen. Initially dismissing these as pranks, these footprints persisted even after being painted over. This, though, was just the beginning of a series of events that would come to be known as the Dawdleston Messages. Basically, messages started coming up on a BBC microcomputer that Ken had borrowed from the school for Nick's use. These messages, initially cryptic and filled with archaic language, claimed to be from a man named Lucas, who purportedly lived in the 16th century. The messages were really oddly spelled and grammatically strange, but they were compelling enough to capture the household's full attention. Ken, Debbie, and Nick found themselves communicating with this Lucas through the computer. Lucas claimed to see and hear the activities in Meadow Cottage, often commenting on photographs and items left around the house. His messages were filled with references to historical events and figures. Lucas expressed confusion when Ken mentioned the year 1985, as he believed Ken and Debbie were from the year 2109, like another mysterious entity that Lucas referred to as the friend who brought the box of lights. This friend from 2109 seemed to have introduced the computer to Lucas. When Ken attempted to communicate with this 2109, he received responses that were even more weird. The entity from 2109 spoke in a scientific and somewhat cryptic manner, suggesting that Ken, Debbie, and their friends were part of an experiment that would change the face of history. As the messages continued, Ken became even more determined to uncover the truth. He enlisted the help of Peter Trinder, an English teacher and a keen investigator of historical texts, and John Cummins, a local solicitor. Together, they analyzed the language and content of the messages, discovering that Lucas's writings were consistent with 16th century English from the Cheshire region. Despite the historical accuracy of Lucas's language, there were numerous inconsistencies in the details he had provided, such as incorrect dates and events. However, these inconsistencies were sometimes addressed in later messages, as Lucas seemed to correct his earlier statements. He eventually revealed his full name as Thomas Harden or Howarden, a name that could be traced back to historical records of a vicar in Gloucestershire during the 1550s. The situation, though, became even more puzzling when Lucas described seeing green lights emanating from his chimney, which he referred to as the Leams or the box of lights. He claimed to have spoken to a mysterious messenger who left these lights, and that by speaking to them he could send messages to Ken and Debbie. This connection between different points in time, being 1546, 1985, and 2109, created a weird narrative that defied conventional understanding. In an effort to find answers, Ken invited the Society of Psychical Research to investigate the phenomena. The SPR conducted several visits but failed to experience any of the unusual activities firsthand. Despite this, though, the messages still continued, and Lucas eventually mentioned that he was being forced from his land and would leave something for his friends in the future. He promised to write a book about the events, which he would hide for future generations to find. The involvement of 2109 is something important to note, though, since it added more mystery. This entity seemed to have vested interest in the communications and occasionally intervened in the messages between Ken and Lucas. They claimed to be part of a tachyon universe and insisted that Ken and his friends had a significant role to play in history. However, their guidance was often vague and left more questions than answers. The narrative of the Dawson messages continued to evolve from then, with paranormal activities happening in Meadow Cottage. Debbie even reported receiving visions and dreams involving Lucas. One of the most compelling aspects of the story, though, was the detailed analysis of the messages by Peter Trinder. He carefully traced the language and dialect used by Lucas, confirming that it was consistent with the mid-16th century. Despite this evidence, though, the SPR still remained skeptical. They suggested that the messages could be the result of sensitive microphones picking up sounds of typing, or that someone could be using the earth wire of the computer to send and receive data. However, these explanations did not fully account for all of the messages and the historical details that they contained. The Vanishing Hotel in France. Lennon, Cynthia Gisby, and Geoff and Pauline Simpson were close friends who decided to take a late summer holiday together in 1979. Their plan was to take the ferry from Dover, Kent, and then travel through France, driving overnight to reach their destination in Spain the next day. After 2 weeks of enjoying the early autumn sunshine in Spain, they planned to return to England by the same route. The journey began smoothly, but by the end of the first long and hot day in France, exhaustion had set in. Len wanted to keep driving, but Cynthia and Pauline were weary. Apart from brief stops, they had been in the car for about 12 hours by now. Somewhere near Montélimar, it was agreed that they should find a place to rest for the night, have an evening meal, and get some breakfast in the morning. They then came off the auto route at Montélimar North, where a sign indicated that there was a motel. Len went to investigate but found that the motel had only one room left. The receptionist suggested that they try finding a smaller hotel along a little back road towards Avignon, which might have some vacancies. Cynthia remembered the little side road as very quiet, with fencing along it and old photographs and posters, including one advertising a circus stuck on the wall. The road then narrowed and became cobbled, making them worry they wouldn't find the hotel. Eventually, a long building resembling a barn with an extra story appeared. Len went inside and found it was a restaurant with accommodation. Despite some language difficulties, he discovered that they had 2 rooms available, much to everyone's relief. Pauline took her overnight bag to the bedroom, which she described as weird. The sheets were thick, large, and bleached white, and there were no pillows at all, only a round bolster across the top of the bed. The room also had a dim light and no electrical switches. Later, they were given candles to climb the stairs. The bathroom was at the end of a long corridor, huge, with an antique bath sunk into the floor and a soap stuck on a metal spike on the wall. The windows had slatted shutters but no glass. Downstairs in the dining room, Len and Cynthia were equally bemused. A woman in an old-fashioned dress and a fringed cap asked what they wanted. Recognizing the word oaf, Cynthia ordered eggs. The woman had eggs and sautéed potatoes, while the men had steak. The cutlery was heavy and basic looking, and Len was particularly impressed by the beer served in quaint old jars with stoppers, unlike anything they had ever tasted before. The meal was enjoyable, and in the next room, rustic-looking Frenchmen sat around a large wooden table. After the meal, they went to bed, tired from the long day. None of them recalled dreaming, and they fell asleep quickly. The road outside was devoid of any traffic, but Len recalled hearing a whistling or hooting, possibly from a nearby railway line. The next morning, they woke early to continue their journey. The hotel manager, wearing an old-style thick white shirt, was mopping the floor, which caused a delay before they could go down for breakfast. Len and Geoff took pictures of Cynthia and Pauline framed in a window opening. Breakfast was unusual. The bread was heavy, coarse, and sweet, and the coffee was black and sludge-like. While they ate, 2 policemen then entered. Len had never seen uniforms like theirs, dark with gaiters up to their knees and one wearing a tall pillar box hat. Geoff agreed, noting the dark blue uniforms. They had seen gendarmes on their route south, but none wore clothing like this. The visitors amused it was a custom peculiar to this rural part of France. A young woman in mauve then entered, looking even stranger. Her skirt had reached her ankles, was uneven at the bottom, and she wore shoes with buttons up the side. At 7 a.m. in the middle of nowhere, it seemed unlikely she had been to a fancy dress party, but she and the gendarmes chatted lively as the visitors watched in amusement. Len then asked one of the policemen for directions to Avignon. The gendarme looked baffled at the word Otteru, but described a way to Avignon that seemed very roundabout when checked on the map. They decided to retrace their steps from the previous night. Before leaving, Len settled the bill. The patron wrote 19 on a piece of paper. Len thought it was 19 francs but argued it should be more, but the policeman insisted, non fini 19 francs. Pauline mimed that they had dinner and slept upstairs, trying to convey they should pay more, but nothing changed. The bill stood at 19 francs, about 60 pence per person for the bed, breakfast, and dinner. They paid and hurried to their car, feeling that they had gotten a great deal. After their 2-week holiday in Spain, they decided to stay at the same hotel on their return journey. The weather had deteriorated, making them eager to find the comfortable hotel again. However, they couldn't find it. They turned around multiple times, retracing their steps, but the hotel was nowhere to be found. They recognized landmarks like the red wall with old posters and the lay-by where they had stopped before, but the hotel itself had vanished. The trees along the road, small 2 weeks earlier, were now large. Frustrated and unable to find the hotel, they drove to Lyon for the night, where a sandwich and a night's stay cost them 247 francs, 13 times what they had paid at the disappearing hotel. Back home in Kent, they were puzzled but not convinced anything supernatural had occurred. They had stayed at the hotel, so there had to be an explanation. Both couples had taken photographs to prove it. Geoff's point and shoot camera took 12 exposures, but none showed the hotel. Len's camera also failed to produce any pictures of the hotel. The negatives showed no blanks, just scratch marks suggesting that the camera might have tried to wind on. They decided not to discuss the incident further, finding it unsettling. The story came out accidentally 4 years later when a friend shared it with a local newspaper journalist. In July 1985, Geoff and Pauline Simpson were hypnotically regressed by a Manchester psychiatrist to relive the time slip, an experiment set up by researcher Harry Harris. Geoff recalled the experience with emotion and detail, but little new information was gained. Pauline remained too disturbed by the experience to respond to hypnosis. In 1995, Pauline expressed continued perturbation about the incident, trying to block it out. The Simpsons and Gisbys maintained that they did not make up the story and had no profit from it. Len and Cynthia were more open to a paranormal explanation. They consulted a French dressmaker about the clothing they saw at the hotel. She identified the gendarmes' uniform as pre-1905, fitting the style of a woman's clothing. Len found that the price they paid for accommodation was consistent with the rates from around 1905, suggesting that the hotel existed in that time. The friends speculated about living in the past and the implications for history. What if someone in 1905 had seen their car and used it to invent modern vehicles? Would history have changed? Could actions in 1905 have prevented their own births, creating a paradox? The logic was mind-numbing, highlighting why science struggles with the concept of time travel. If time slips are possible, they could represent one of the most important paranormal phenomena. They challenge the foundations of time, space, cause and effect, and modern physics. Len and Cynthia's detective work provided some clues, but the mystery still remained unsolved. They genuinely believed that they had spent a night living in the past. Moberly Jourdain incident. Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, both academics from Britain, decided to take a holiday in France in 1901, which led to a series of extraordinary events that became known as the Moberly Jourdain incident. This incident, also referred to as the ghost of Petit Trianon or Versailles, is a well-documented case of alleged time travel and hauntings. The two women, who were not particularly knowledgeable about the historical specifics of Versailles, embarked on their journey with an open mind. Moberly, the principal of St. Hugh's College in Oxford, and Jourdain, her assistant, shared a mutual interest in exploring the famed grounds of Versailles, despite their limited expectations about what they might encounter. The incident took place on August 10, 1901, when Moberly and Jourdain decided to visit the Petit Trianon, a small chateau within the grounds of the Palace of Versailles. They set out with a Baedeker guidebook, but after missing a turn for the main avenue, Allée de Trianon, they became lost. As they wandered, they experienced a sudden change in atmosphere, described as oppressive and dreary. Moberly noticed a woman shaking a white cloth out of the window, while Jourdain observed an old deserted farmhouse with an old plow outside. They encountered men who appeared to be palace gardeners, dressed in long grayish-green coats with small three-cornered hats, who directed them to continue straight on. As they reached the edge of a wood near the Temple de l'Amour, they saw a man seated beside a garden kiosk, wearing a cloak and a large shady hat. His appearance was described as repulsive, with a dark and rough complexion marked by smallpox. Another man, tall with large dark eyes and crisp curling black hair under a large sombrero hat, approached them and directed them to the Petit Trianon. Moberly then noticed a lady sketching on the grass, dressed in a light summer dress and a shady white hat with much fair hair. Initially thinking that she was a tourist, Moberly later identified the lady as Marie Antoinette, based on a resemblance to a portrait by Adolphe Müller. After returning to the palace and joining a party of other visitors, Moberly and Jourdain had tea at the Hotel des Reservoirs before heading back to Jourdain's apartment. It wasn't until a week later that Moberly mentioned the incident to Jourdain, asking if she thought that the Petit Trianon was haunted. Jourdain agreed, and 3 months later they compared notes and wrote separate accounts of the experience. They speculated that they had witnessed events from the 10th of August 1792, just weeks before the abolition of the French monarchy. Their subsequent visits to the Trianon Gardens failed to trace their original path. Landmarks such as the kiosk and the bridge were missing, and the grounds were full of people, unlike their earlier experience. They considered the possibility of stumbling upon a private event, but found no records of any such event on that day. Through their research, they believed the man they saw by the kiosk was the Comte de Vaudreuil, a friend of Marie Antoinette. Convinced the grounds were haunted, they published their account in a book titled An Adventure in 1911 under the pseudonyms Elizabeth Morrison and Francis Lamont. The book caused a sensation, but faced much ridicule and skepticism. Critics pointed out inconsistencies and implausibilities in their story. A review by Eleanor Mildred Sidgwick in the Proceedings of the Society of Psychical Research suggested that Moberly and Jourdain had misinterpreted normal events. In 1903, an old map of the Trianon Gardens was found showing a bridge the woman claimed to have crossed, which had not been on any other maps. The authors' identities were not revealed until 1931. Both women claimed numerous paranormal experiences before and after the incident. Moberly, for instance, claimed to have seen an apparition of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the Louvre in 1914. During World War I, Jourdain, who had succeeded as principal of St. Hugh's, became increasingly convinced that a German spy was hiding in the college. Her autocratic behavior led to mass resignations of academic staff, and she died suddenly in 1924 amid an academic scandal. Moberly died in 1937. The story of their adventure was adapted into a television film, Miss Morrison's Ghost, in 1981, and a 90-minute radio dramatization by the BBC in 2004 and 2015. Several explanations and critiques have been proposed. Philippe Julien suggested that Moberly and Jourdain might have inadvertently gatecrashed a fancy dress party given by Robert de Montesquieu, a known dandy who held extravagant garden parties at Versailles. According to this theory, the woman might have mistaken the partygoers for historical figures. Another explanation is that the incident was a shared delusion or hallucinatory experience, possibly induced by the extreme heat. Brian Dunning of Skeptoid concluded that Moberly and Jourdain were simply mistaken. He noted that editions of an adventure were embellished with each publication, and inconsistencies in their memories were apparent. For example, Morbely did not mention the sketching woman to Jourdain until 3 months after the visit, and Jourdain did not remember such a thing. Their descriptions of footbridges and kiosks could not fit any number of existing structures in the vast grounds of Versailles. And Dame Joan Evans, who owned the copyright to An Adventure, accepted Julian's explanation and forbade any further additions. However, after the work came out of copyright, it was republished in 1988 and 2008, crediting Moberly and Jourdain as the authors. Historian Rose Strong noted that despite the story being debunked, it still retained its hold on the public imagination for half a century. 3 British boys travel to medieval England. In 1957, 3 British boys embarked on a journey that would lead them into what they believed was a different time period. The incident began on an autumn morning when the trio, all Royal Navy cadets, set out on a map reading exercise designed to test their navigation skills. Their destination was Suffolk village of Kersey, known for its medieval charm and historical significance. The cadets, William Lang, Michael Crowley, and Ray Baker, were relatively new to the Royal Navy, and this exercise was part of their training regimen. As they approached the village, the boys began to notice an unusual silence that gripped the area. The church bells, which had been ringing in the distance, abruptly stopped. Even the ducks by the shallow stream that crossed the road stood motionless. The typical sounds of nature, such as birdsong, faded away as they neared the first houses of the village. Not a single leaf stirred on the trees as they passed, and the trees themselves cast no shadows. What was even more weird was that the high street of Kersey was devoid of any signs of modernity. There were no cars parked by the roadside, no phone wires strung along the roads, and no aerials on the roofs. The houses looked ancient, with ragged hand-built timber frame structures that seemed almost medieval in appearance. The boys, curious and a bit unnerved, decided to investigate further. They approached the nearest building, a butcher shop, and pressed their faces to its grimy windows. What they saw inside, though, kind of horrified them, being that there were no tables or counters, just 2 or 3 whole oxen carcasses that had been skinned and were quite green with age. The windows with smallish glass panes were dirty and smeared. The boys felt a sense of disbelief and unreality, questioning how such conditions could exist in 1957. They then moved on to another house, which also had greenish, smeary windows. This house too appeared uninhabited. The walls were crudely whitewashed, and the rooms were empty of possessions or furniture, appearing to be not of modern-day quality. Spooked by these observations, the cadets decided to leave the strange village. As they climbed a small hill, they noticed the silence persisted. It was only when they reached the top and turned back that they heard the church bells ring once more and saw smoke rising from chimneys. None of the chimneys had been smoking while they were in the village. The boys then ran for a few hundred yards to shake off the weird feeling that had overcome them. Years later, reflecting on the incident, William Lang described Kersey as a ghost village. He recounted an overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression, along with the sense of unfriendliness and unseen watchers. These sensations sent a shiver down his spine, and he wondered what might have happened if they had knocked on a door to ask a question. The thought of who might have answered was unsettling itself. Lang, from Perthshire in the Highlands of Scotland, was a stranger to this part of England, as were his friends Crowley from Worcestershire and Baker from London. Their unfamiliarity with the area made it easy for their superiors to confirm that they had reached the correct village by checking their descriptions. However, their superiors were skeptical of their account, dismissing it with laughter and agreeing that they had seen Kersey. The matter rested until the late 1980s when Lang and Crowley, both living in Australia, reconnected and discussed the incident. Lang had always been troubled by it, while Crowley did not remember it much in detail, but agreed that something strange had definitely occurred. He recalled the silence, the lack of aerials and streetlights, and the bizarre butcher's shop. This prompted Lang to write to Andrew Mackenzie, a leading member of the Society of Psychical Research. Mackenzie found Lang's letter intriguing and recognized it as a potential case of retrocognition, a term used by the society for what is commonly known as a time slip. After lengthy correspondence and a thorough investigation, including a visit to Kersey with Lang in 1990, Mackenzie concluded that the cadets might have seen Kersey as it was centuries earlier. Mackenzie's research into the Kersey incident led him to draw some conclusions. Several factors convinced him of the cadets' genuine experience. These included the sincerity of Lang and Crowley, the detailed recollections, and specific discoveries that aligned with historical facts. For example, the house identified by Lang as a butcher's shop was a private residence in 1957, had been a butcher's shop as early as 1790. Additionally, the changing season as the cadets entered the village suggested a different time period. A particularly puzzling aspect, though, was the absence of the village church, St. Mary's, which dates back to the 14th century and is basically a principal landmark in the district. Both Lang and Crowley recalled no sign of the church, which is visible from the main street. Mackenzie suggested that this anomaly could help pinpoint the day of the cadets' visit. Noting that the construction of the church tower was halted by the Black Death in 1348-9, which killed half the population of Kersey, he theorized that the cadets might have seen the village as it was after the plague. The shell of the half-constructed church would have been hidden by the trees, fitting their description. But despite the compelling elements of the story, historical analysis offers alternative explanations. Kersey, an ancient village first mentioned in an Anglo-Saxon will of around 900, retains numerous medieval buildings, making it easy for visitors to feel transported to an earlier time. The village, a favorite for filmmakers, features many thatched, half-timbered buildings alongside more mundane architecture. The combination of striking remnants and the absence of modern elements could have contributed to the boys' perception of traveling back in time. Also, Kersey was not connected to the mains until the early 1950s. Efforts to preserve its skyline led to overhead lines being placed between houses and cables laid underground. This explains the lack of wires and aerials that the cadets had noted. The mention of windows in their account also raises some questions, as glass was rare and expensive in the 14th to 15th centuries. While Kersey's wealth might have made it an exception, the houses would unlikely have been devoid of furniture if they were wealthy. Another issue is the presence of the butcher shop in a medieval village. While such shops existed in towns, meat was expensive, and most peasants' diets were primarily vegetarian. Animals slaughtered in a village for special occasions would be consumed immediately. Historical records indicate that beef consumption was rare, with only a few cattle slaughtered annually in nearby villages. The notion of a butcher shop with several whole ox carcasses in stock as early as 1420 stretches credulity. Given these historical inconsistencies, the cadets' experience might be better explained by psychological factors. The silence and lack of life are suggestive of derealization, a condition where the real world seems unreal. The lack of agreement between the witnesses is also notable, as Ray Baker recalled nothing unusual about Kersey. The close agreement between Lang and Crowley could result from mutual reinforcement over time. Studies show that the passage of time can accentuate odd details and smooth out differences in witness accounts. The time-traveling Air Marshal. So this talks about the tale of Air Marshal Sir Robert Victor Goddard. With a distinguished military career and a knighthood, Goddard's claims in his 1975 autobiographical book, Flight Towards Reality, took many by surprise. He recounted an extraordinary event from 1935 when his Hawker Hart light bomber encountered a storm above an abandoned RAF airfield near Edinburgh, later reactivated as DREM. In the midst of the storm, Goddard claimed to have witnessed an astonishing vision, being yellow-painted aircraft and a Marne monoplane, neither of which were in RAF service at that time. Mechanics dressed in blue coveralls instead of the standard RAF brown worked on these aircraft. The dilapidated buildings appeared renovated, and new structures had been constructed. These apparent discrepancies suggested that Goddard had been propelled forward in time by around 4 years. By 1939, the airfield would indeed be populated with yellow-painted Hawker Harts relegated to training duties and airspeed Oxford monoplanes of the 13 Flying Training School. This claim, like many in the realm of the paranormal though, is difficult to explain if taken at face value. We have no way of knowing how accurately this version of events corresponds with what actually happened that day, not because of any deceit on Goddard's part, but more because of the inherent fallibility of human memory. Goddard, though, undoubtedly believed in the reality of his experience, having lived through the events in question. However, even the word of an honorable military professional must be scrutinized, as his credentials did not prepare him to deal with paranormal experiences. The possible explanations are numerous and mundane. It's said he may have misremembered the year of the incident or certain aspects of what he saw. Such lapses are unlikely for a trained military pilot, but the modification of memories over time is a well-documented phenomenon in psychology. Given the elapsed time between the incident and the report, it's more plausible that he misinterpreted what he saw on the ground. The Avro 504N trainers specified by Goddard had been replaced in RAF service by 1935. The 13 Flying Training School did not operate them, yellow or not. The high-tech monoplane configuration was already known, with flight testing of new breeds like the Hawker Hurricane underway that same year. Goddard later supposed he saw Mel's Magister trainer, which first flew in 1937, but the first Mel's monoplane flew in 1933. Despite this though, it's still unlikely that any of these aircraft could have been parked at the disused airfield in 1935. A more rational explanation might be that Goddard, disoriented by the storm's blind flying and violent maneuvers, ended up above a completely different aerodrome. Navigation in the 1930s relied on dead reckoning, requiring visible and correctly identified landmarks. Without these, one could easily end up far off course. The question though is, if Goddard was not over Drem, where was he? Renfrew Aerodrome, home to the Scottish Flying Club, is a likely candidate. The club used Avro 504s and civil aircraft, including brightly colored monoplanes, were regular visitors. An antecedent of the Magister that Goddard thought he saw was photographed at Renfrew that year. Maintenance staff were civilians, so blue overalls would not be unusual. Although Renfrew is 70 miles from Drem, such a deviation in course is not impossible on a 400-mile cross-country journey. This scenario is more plausible than the appearance of a door into the future. Goddard's story though continues to be reported, often uncritically, because of his service history and status. The events even inspired a 1955 film starring Michael Redgrave and Denholm Elliott, and may have even influenced the 1980s time travel film The Final Countdown. After leaving the RAF and writing about his flight, Goddard became a notable figure in the UFO community, coining the term ufology. He also claimed to have taken a photograph of a ghost. The Cat Time Slip. In the quiet town of Tunbridge Wells, on the morning of June 18, 1968, an elderly lady named Mrs. Charlotte Warburton embarked on a routine shopping trip with her husband. They decided to go their separate ways for a while, planning to meet up later. Mrs. Warburton, unable to find her preferred brand of coffee at her usual grocer, ventured into a supermarket on Calverley Road. As she entered, she noticed a small cafe through an entrance on the left-hand wall. This cafe was unfamiliar to her, though she had frequented the area many times before. The cafe appeared old-fashioned, with wood-paneled walls, no windows, and lit by several electric bulbs with frosted shades. Mrs. Warburton did not initially find anything peculiar about the cafe. She observed two women in long dresses sitting at one table and about half a dozen men in dark lounge suits at other tables further back. Everyone seemed to be drinking coffee and chatting, which seemed typical for a country town at 11 o'clock in the morning. Nothing struck her as unusual, not even the formal and slightly anachronistic clothing or the fact that although the customers were talking, there was no audible noise from them. Nor did she notice the absence of the smell of coffee, which would typically permeate such an establishment. Without questioning her surroundings, Mrs. Warburton left the cafe and met with her husband as planned. She didn't mention anything odd about the cafe to him. On their next shopping trip though to Tunbridge Wells, she decided to show her husband the cafe. However, despite searching the street up and down, they couldn't find it. When they inquired at the supermarket, they were told that there was no cafe there and that she must be mistaken about the location. They learned that the site had once been home to the Cosmos Kinema, which had included a small cafe. They were then directed to the Tunbridge Wells Constitutional Club, where the steward informed them that the club had once owned the premises adjoining the Cosmos. The club had an assembly room and a small bar with tables for refreshments, which matched Mrs. Warburton's description exactly. This bar, along with the cinema and assembly room, had vanished years ago, yet Mrs. Warburton had seemingly stepped into the past on that June morning. Another interesting time slip incident occurred in Kent in 1935. Dr. E.G. Moon, a pragmatic Scottish physician with a practice in Broadstairs, was visiting his patient, Lord Carson, at Cleeve Court in Minster, Thanet. After attending to Carson, Dr. Moon made his way downstairs, preoccupied with the instructions he had given to the nurse regarding Carson's prescription. At the front door, he hesitated, considering whether to return upstairs to speak with the nurse again. It was then that he noticed his car was no longer where he had parked it, next to a thick yew hedge, which was also missing. The driveway down which he had driven had turned into a muddy track. A man dressed in an old-fashioned coat with several capes around the shoulders, wearing a top hat and carrying a long-barreled gun, then approached Dr. Moon. The man looked as if he belonged in the 19th century. Dr. Moon, however, was not alarmed or even surprised by the changed scenery or the man's appearance. He was preoccupied with thoughts about Lord Carson's prescription. He turned back into the house without concern, but took one last look at the scene. Suddenly, everything returned to normal. Being his car was back, the yew hedge reappeared, the driveway was no longer a muddy track, and the man had vanished. Only then did Dr. Moon realize that something odd had definitely occurred. This event lasted only seconds, explaining why Dr. Moon did not immediately investigate the missing car or speak to the strangely dressed man. He seemed to have been drawn to an accepting, hallucinatory state. Upon his return to his own time, he described the experience to Lady Carson, but insisted that no word of it should be revealed during his lifetime, fearing that his patients would question his judgment. The story then came to light only after his death. The Torrid Man. In the summer of 1954, a day that seemed typical at Haneda Airport in Tokyo became the setting for an endearing mystery. A man outwardly unmarkable arrived at the airport. He was Caucasian, bearded, and dressed in a suit. He was fluent in French and had a decent command of Japanese. His demeanor and appearance were not extraordinary, but the document he presented to the immigration officers was. His passport, though appearing legitimate, stated it was issued by the country of Torrid. To the officers, Torrid was a place that didn't exist on any map or in any records. When questioned, the man insisted fervently that Torrid was real and had been for 1,000 years. His insistence and frustration did nothing to clarify the situation though. The authorities, suspecting him of being a criminal, decided to detain him. He was placed in a nearby hotel under guard while they investigated further. The following morning, when they went to retrieve him, they found his room empty. There were no signs of escape, and the guards had not seen him leave. The man had simply vanished. The story has interested many, leading to various interpretations. Some view the tale of the Torrid Man as evidence of parallel universes, suggesting that he may have slipped into a dimension from another where Torrid existed. Others believe the entire incident is a fabricated myth. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. One of the most interesting elements of the story is the man's unwavering assertion about Torrid's existence. When shown a map, he pointed to Andorra, nestled between France and Spain, claiming that this was where Torrid should be. His exasperation grew as he couldn't understand why Torrid wasn't on the map. Adding to the puzzle though, he possessed currency from various European countries and stamps from numerous airports around the world. He claimed to have visited Tokyo before, yet no record of him existed with the companies or hotels he mentioned. The situation took an even stranger turn with his disappearance from the hotel. The room was secure, high up, and had no balcony. The police confirmed he could not have left through the window, and the guards did not see him exit. These circumstances led many to speculate that the man had somehow returned to his own dimension, leaving no trace behind. While this narrative is interesting, it's also essential to consider the more mundane explanation rooted in reality. The man known as the Torrid Man was likely John Allen Zegras, a fraudster arrested in Tokyo in 1960. Zegras, a more mundane and earthly figure, had a history of using a fake passport and engaging in fraudulent activities. During a debate in the British House of Commons on July 29, 1960, Zegras was described as presenting himself as an intelligent agent and a naturalized Ethiopian, carrying a passport written in an unknown language. This passport, which claimed to be from the state of Torrid, was identified as a forgery. Zegras' passport, supposedly issued in Tamanrose, the capital of Torrid, indicated a state south of the Sahara with a population of 2 million. This fictional account was part of his scheme to travel the world. The Vancouver-based paper, The Province, reported Zegras' extensive travels using this fake passport, which bore a mysterious proclamation beneath the national symbol of Torrid. This phrase was nonsensical in any language, further indicating the fraudulent nature of his documents. Zegras' ruse unraveled in Tokyo when his passport was scrutinized and found to be a fake. Japanese officials, thorough in their investigations, found no evidence of a state of Torrid. Zegras' attempts to convince them failed, leading to his arrest. After being sentenced to 1 year in prison, Zegras attempted to take his own life, but survived. Reports from Japanese newspapers at the time detailed his desperate actions and his subsequent detention. Zegras had entered Japan with his Korean wife in 1959, struggling to fund their stay. He cashed counterfeit checks and falsely claimed to be from various intelligence agencies. Despite his sentence though, the time he had already spent in detention led to his release without serving further prison time. Zegras declared his intention to start a new life in another country, but his true identity and origins remained a mystery. After his release, he faded from historical records, and it's said his story transformed into the legend of the Torrid Man.